I walked into the steakhouse expecting the smell of celebration, but all I caught was the metallic scent of an ambush. My promotion to senior analyst had been public for exactly 48 hours, and for 48 hours, my phone had been uncharacteristically silent. No proud of you texts from my father, no drinks on me calls from my brother, Leo. Just a single, formal invitation from my mother for a Sunday dinner at the most expensive place in the city. I thought, for once, they were putting aside the envy to acknowledge that the kid they always called the reliable disappointment had actually made something of himself. I settled into the leather booth, straightened my tie, and looked at the three of them. They weren't looking at me. They were looking at my briefcase, or perhaps the watch on my wrist that cost more than my father's car. The appetizers hadn't even hit the table before the atmosphere shifted from celebratory to clinical. My mother didn't ask about my new salary or the responsibilities of the role. She simply reached into her designer purse, which I had bought her for Christmas, and slid a thick, manila envelope across the white tablecloth. It landed with a heavy thud right next to my water glass. I opened it, expecting a card. Instead, I found a stack of credit card statements, overdue business loan notices, and a final demand letter from a private lender. The number at the bottom was circled in red ink, $120,000. I looked up, the celebratory mood draining out of me like cold water. Leo was leaning back, picking at his teeth, looking entirely too comfortable for someone whose failed lifestyle brand was the primary reason for 80% of those charges. My father took a slow sip of his wine, cleared his throat, and looked me dead in the eye. He didn't offer a preamble. He just said that the family was in a hole and that since I was the one who had clearly mastered the art of making money, it was time I mastered the art of being a son. I asked him if this was a joke. I asked Leo why I was looking at a 5-figure debt for a warehouse lease in a city he doesn't even live in. My mother reached across the table, not to hold my hand in a gesture of affection, but to tap the paper with a manicured finger. She told me that they had sacrificed everything to ensure I had the stability to get that fancy degree and that high-paying job. She said that while I was busy climbing the corporate ladder, the rest of them were struggling to keep the family legacy alive. It was a lie, of course. The family legacy was a string of Leo's impulsive whims and my parents' refusal to say no to their favorite child. I told them I wasn't paying it. I told them that a promotion didn't make me a bank and that my savings were for my own future, not for subsidizing their incompetence. The table went silent. The waiter tried to approach with our drinks, saw the look on my father's face, and retreated without a word. My father's face turned a shade of purple I had only seen when I was 10 and accidentally broke his favorite golf club. He leaned over the table, his voice a low, vibrating hiss, and said the words that finally broke the last string of my loyalty. He told me that they gave me life, and the very least I could do was give them a future. He called it an investment. He said I was a dividend they were finally cashing in. I stood up, the chair screeching against the floor, and grabbed my coat. I told them the dinner was over and that they could find someone else to bail them out. I was halfway to the door, feeling the heat of their glares on my back, when my mother's voice stopped me cold. She didn't scream. She sounded almost pitying. She told me I could walk away, but the collectors wouldn't. She told me she had already called the lender that morning and updated the file, providing my name, my work address, and my social security number as the primary guarantor for the entire balance. I sat in the darkness of my apartment for 3 hours after leaving that restaurant, the manila envelope resting on my coffee table like a ticking bomb. The silence was heavy, the kind that forces you to listen to the thoughts you've spent a decade trying to outrun. I eventually reached for a dusty plastic bin at the back of my closet, pulling out the old photo albums my mother had pawned off on me when I moved out, claiming she didn't have the space. As I flipped through the sticky, yellowed pages, the cold burn started to settle in. I wasn't looking at a family history, I was looking at a ledger of exploitation. There was a photo of me at 10 years old, standing in the rain with a saturated canvas bag slung over my shoulder. I remembered that morning vividly. It was the day I had to finish my paper route before school because my father told me that if I wanted new sneakers for gym class, I had to find a way to pay for them myself. In the very next photo, taken 3 weeks later on Christmas, my brother Leo was grinning like a shark, unwrapping a brand new PlayStation. I looked at my own feet in the background of that shot, wearing the cheap, generic shoes I'd spent 2 months of pre-dawn labor to afford. The contrast wasn't just a childhood quirk, it was the blueprint of our entire lives. I was the engine that kept the house running, the reliable one who was expected to provide labor in silence, while Leo was the star who was provided with everything. I remembered being 12 and staying up until midnight to help my mother color code her filing system for her part-time job, only for her to tell me that I couldn't go to the movies with my friends because the family couldn't afford the ticket. Meanwhile, Leo was upstairs in a room full of expensive hobbies he'd abandoned within a month. I realized then that I was never a child to them. I was a safety net. I was a backup plan. I was a resource to be mined until the veins ran dry. I flipped through the pages, seeing the pattern repeat, me working at the grocery store at 16 to pay for my own car insurance, while they bought Leo a used sedan that he wrecked within 6 months. They hadn't raised a son, they had cultivated a creditor. I felt a hollow ache in my chest that went beyond anger. It was a profound, morning sort of clarity. I reached for my old middle school diary, tucked into the back of the album, hoping to find some shred of evidence that I was being too harsh, some memory of a time when I felt truly protected. Instead, as I shook the book, a small, hand-stitched notebook fell out from between the pages. It was my father's handwriting. It was a hidden ledger, meticulously kept in the margins of his old work notes. As my eyes scanned the columns, the air left the room. He had been tracking every single cent of birthday money, every $20 bill from my grandmother, and every graduation check I'd ever received. But he wasn't tracking it to save for me. There were notes next to each entry: gas, electricity, Leo's camp, dinner. He hadn't just been neglecting me, he had been systematically stealing from my childhood for years before I even knew how to count. It wasn't just that they wanted my future now, they had already spent my past. The mourning period ended at exactly 3 a.m. I stopped looking at the photos and started looking at the numbers. If they wanted to treat our relationship like a business transaction, I decided I was going to be the most ruthless auditor they had ever encountered. I pulled my laptop onto the coffee table and began the grim task of digitizing 15 years of financial betrayal. My training as a senior analyst kicked in, turning my grief into a cold, sharp instrument. I started with my own credit history, pulling every report from the 3 major bureaus. My heart didn't even race when I saw it: a credit card opened 7 years ago, right when I was finishing my sophomore year of college. The address on the account wasn't my dormitory, it was my parents' house. They had used my social security number to open a high-interest line of credit while I was literally eating ramen noodles to save money for textbooks. I tracked the payments. They were sporadic, just enough to keep the account from being closed, but the balance had been ballooned by late fees and over-limit penalties. I downloaded every statement, my eyes tracing the purchases. They weren't buying groceries or paying the electric bill. They were buying designer shoes, high-end electronics, and dinners at places they never took me. I downloaded every statement, my eyes tracing the purchases. They weren't buying groceries or paying the electric bill. They were buying designer shoes, high-end electronics, and dinners at places they never took me. I had kept every text message, every email where he promised to pay me back as soon as the bonus clears. I cross-referenced those dates with the secret ledger I found in my father's notebook. On the exact day I sent him $500 for a broken water heater, he had recorded a deposit into Leo's private account for the same amount, marked simply as Leo's fun money. It was a systematic siphoning of my labor. I built a spreadsheet with the precision of a criminal prosecutor. Column A, the date. Column B, the amount stolen or borrowed. Column C, the compounded interest. I factored in the inflation and the opportunity cost of the money they had taken from my youth. I found old IOUs scrawled on the back of junk mail envelopes, things I had saved as a teenager because I desperately wanted to believe my parents were people of their word. I scanned them all into a PDF titled The Liability of Blood. As I dug deeper into the discovery phase, I gained access to a shared cloud drive my mother had accidentally left me logged into years ago. She'd forgotten I had the password, or perhaps she just assumed I was too reliable to ever snoop. Inside a folder hidden 3 layers deep, I found the documentation for the $120,000 debt they had tried to ambush me with at dinner. This wasn't a sudden crisis. This was a slow-motion car crash they had been steering for a decade. I saw the business venture Leo had started, a luxury concierge service that had no clients, no revenue, and a lease on a penthouse office that cost $6,000 a month. I found the receipts for the furniture, the Italian leather chairs, and the gold-plated espresso machine. They hadn't just been struggling, they had been play-acting as royalty on my dime. I spent 4 hours reconciling their spending with their pleas for help. Every time my mother called me crying because she couldn't afford her medication, she was actually making a payment on a timeshare in Cabo that I wasn't even aware existed. Every time my father told me he was worried about losing the house, he was actually funding a third relaunch of Leo's failed clothing line. The betrayal was total. It wasn't just that they had spent my money, they had spent my empathy. They had used my love for them as a line of credit they never intended to close. I realized then that the $120,000 wasn't just a number. It was the price of their vanity. They didn't want me to save the family, they wanted me to fund the fantasy that Leo was a success and that they were the kind of parents who raised winners. I sat back, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes, and looked at the final tally. But the financial theft was only the surface. As I opened the final folder in the cloud drive, I found a series of photos from a family reunion in Hawaii that took place the same week I was told they couldn't afford to fly out for my college graduation. I didn't send an angry text. I didn't post a cryptic status update. I simply opened my banking app and began the clinical process of desponsorship. For years, I had been the silent architect of their comfort, the invisible hand that kept the lights on and the screens glowing. They had become so accustomed to my subsidizing their lives that they had forgotten these things weren't birthrights, they were gifts. Gifts given to people I thought loved me. I started with the entertainment. I logged into the Netflix account that my mother, father, Leo, and even Leo's latest girlfriend were using. I changed the password, updated the recovery email to my work address, and clicked log out of all devices. I did the same with the Disney Plus and the HBO Max accounts. It was petty, perhaps, but I wanted them to feel the first chill of the reality they had invited. If I was a dividend, then the dividends were officially suspended. Next, I moved to the utility that really mattered, the family cell phone plan. I had been paying for 6 lines for nearly 5 years. I pulled up the carrier's dashboard and saw the data usage. Leo was burning through 50 gigabytes a month on social media marketing for his non-existent brand. My father had a top-tier international roaming package active for no reason other than he liked the convenience. I didn't send a warning. I simply port-protected my own number, moved it to a private business account, and then hit the Terminate Service button for the remaining 5 lines. I watched the confirmation screen load with a strange sense of peace. In an instant, their primary connection to the world, and to each other, was severed. The most significant cut, however, was the car insurance. My parents drove a mid-sized SUV that I had helped them finance, under the condition that I would handle the insurance to ensure they were always covered. I had the policy on an automatic monthly withdrawal. It was a high-coverage plan, the kind that protected them from everything. I called the agent and told them to cancel the policy effective immediately. I asked for a prorated refund of the current month's premium to be sent to my personal account. The agent sounded confused, asking if I wanted to transfer the policy to my parents' names. I told him no. I told him they were independent adults who could handle their own risk management from now on. By noon, I had stripped away roughly $400 a month in invisible support. It wasn't about the money anymore, I had plenty of that. It was about the proximity they had used these services to stay tethered to me, to keep a straw in my pocket while they treated me like an outsider. I spent the rest of the afternoon working from my home office, the silence of my apartment finally feeling like a fortress instead of a cage. I knew the storm was coming. I knew that the moment they realized their phones were SOS only and their favorite shows were locked behind a password they didn't own, the entitlement would turn into rage. I was counting on it. I wanted them to feel the friction of the world without my buffer. I wanted them to realize that giving me life didn't buy them a lifetime subscription to my labor. I was halfway through a budget report for my actual job when my desk phone, the landline they didn't have the number for, began to ring. It was a redirected call from my building's front desk. They said my father was downstairs, and he wasn't alone. He was screaming at the security guard about his car being towed, claiming there had been a mistake with the bank. He thought he was losing his vehicle because of a clerical error. He was wrong. The car wasn't being repossessed by the bank yet, but it was being removed from the one place he felt safe. I had one more surprise waiting in the driveway, and it was the one thing he never expected me to actually use against him. The digital onslaught began less than an hour after my father was escorted away from my building. My family didn't have the dignity to settle our disputes in private. They had spent decades performing for an audience, and they weren't about to stop now. My mother led the charge with a video on Facebook that was a masterpiece of manipulative theater. She sat in her dimly lit kitchen, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue I had probably paid for, and spoke directly into the camera about the heartbreak of a cold child. She didn't mention the $120,000 in debt. She didn't mention the identity theft or the years I spent working while Leo slept. Instead, she spoke about the blessings they had poured into me and how, the moment I tasted a little bit of corporate success, I had turned my back on my own flesh and blood. She claimed I had cut off their phones so they couldn't call for medical help and that I had stolen their car from the driveway. Leo was even worse. He took to TikTok, filming a story time while pacing around his apartment, the one I had co-signed for, acting the part of the protective brother who was just so disappointed. He used keywords like narcissist and financial abuse, projecting his own flaws onto me with a practiced ease that made my stomach churn. He told his followers that I was obsessed with status and that I was trying to bankrupt my own parents out of spite. The comments sections under their posts became a feeding ground for the justice-sensitive public who only saw one side of the coin. Total strangers were calling me a monster and a disgrace to the community. Even worse were the messages from people who actually knew us. Neighbors I had shoveled snow for, aunts who had watched me grow up, and high school friends I hadn't spoken to in years began flooding my inbox with vitriol. One neighbor, a man I had once loaned my lawnmower to and never seen again, sent a message saying he always knew I had a mean streak and that I should be ashamed to show my face. It was a fascinating study in social contagion. My years of being the giving one were being used as a weapon against me. Because I had always been the one to step up, the one time I stepped back was viewed as an act of unprecedented cruelty. They had conditioned everyone to see me as a bottomless well of resources, so when the well ran dry, the town decided to stone the well. My mother posted a photo of a notice of cancellation for her car insurance, captioned, "How am I supposed to get to the doctor now? God help us." The notification pings on my phone were a constant, rhythmic reminder that my reputation was being incinerated in real time. My sister-in-law even chimed in, posting a GoFundMe for the family's emergency expenses, claiming they were on the verge of homelessness because of my calculated legal attacks. I watched it all with a detached, clinical interest. I didn't engage in the comments. I didn't record a tearful response video or try to explain the intricacies of credit scores to a mob that didn't care about facts. I let them build the pyre. I let them climb as high as they wanted on their pedestal of moral outrage. I knew that the higher they climbed, the further they would have to fall. Every lie they told was another entry in the ledger I was about to go public with. By 8 o'clock that evening, the smear campaign had reached its peak. My name was being dragged through every local community group, and I had been cancelled by a family that had never actually supported me. My mother sent one final text through a neighbor's phone, telling me it wasn't too late to make this right and pay the $120,000 before she went to the local news. I didn't reply to her. Instead, I opened my laptop and went to the Facebook group where the local drama was hottest. I didn't post a long-winded defense. I didn't beg for mercy. I simply posted a single sentence: the receipts for the $120,000, the identity theft, and the family reunion I wasn't invited to are all right here. Below it, I pasted a link to a public, read-only Google Drive folder. The folder was titled with a simplicity that cut through the noise: the truth about the $120,000. Within seconds, I saw the active viewers count on the documents start to climb from 10 to 100, then to 500. The crowd was about to get exactly what they craved: the numbers that proved the saints were actually the ones holding the knife. The Google Drive link acted like a digital firebreak, halting the spread of their lies with the cold, hard weight of evidence. While the town was busy scrolling through the family reunion photos and the secret credit card statements, I was busy perfecting my masterpiece. I sat at my desk, the glow of the spreadsheet illuminating a face that no longer felt the heat of shame. If my father wanted to claim that raising me was an investment that required a dividend, I was more than happy to provide him with a full accounting of my own. I opened a fresh document and titled it, Invoice for Services Rendered, 1998 to 2016. I wasn't being poetic. I was being a senior analyst. I was calculating the cost of a stolen childhood with the same clinical detachment I used to evaluate corporate mergers. The first line item was the most substantial: unpaid childcare and nanny services. From the age of 8, I was the primary caregiver for Leo. I was the one who woke him up, made his meals, supervised his homework, and stayed home on Friday nights so my parents could go to the movies or out with friends. I calculated the market rate for a live-in nanny during those years, adjusted for inflation, and applied a conservative 25% discount for family loyalty. The total for those 8,000 hours of labor came to exactly $45,000. I attached a scanned copy of my childhood chore chart, the one my mother had made, which clearly listed supervised Leo as a daily requirement for me to earn my $5 weekly allowance. The second item was the stolen identity damage. I didn't just list the balance of the card they opened in my name, I billed them for the damage to my credit score during my early 20s. I calculated the difference in interest rates I had to pay on my first car and my first apartment deposit because of the poor rating they had saddled me with. I added the legal fees I had recently spent to have a forensic accountant verify the signatures. I set that figure at $30,000. It was a fair price for the years of financial anxiety they had forced me to endure while I was trying to build a life from scratch. Then came the emotional labor and parentification fees. This was the hardest to quantify, but the most important to state. I billed them for the hundreds of hours I spent acting as my mother's emotional support during her frequent, self-inflicted crises. I billed them for the crisis management I performed every time my father's temper threatened his employment. I looked at the market rate for an entry-level life coach and social worker, then halved it. The cost for a decade of being the only adult in a house full of grown children was $20,000. The final item was the recovered birthday and gift theft. I didn't rely on memory for this. I used the hidden ledger I had found in my father's notebook. I totaled every loan he had taken from my piggy bank, every graduation check from my aunt that never made it to my savings account, and every $20 bill from my grandmother that was put away for safekeeping and never seen again. With compounded interest over 15 years, that total came to $5,000. I added several smaller line items: the paper route money that went toward household groceries, the rent I was forced to pay the summer before college while Leo lived for free, and the value of the electronics they borrowed and never returned. When I hit the AutoSum button, the bottom line made me smile for the first time in days. $135,000. It was a beautiful number. It was $15,000 more than the debt they were trying to force onto me. I wasn't just even with them, they were officially in the red. I didn't send this via email. I didn't post it on Facebook for the neighbors to see. I wanted this delivered with the same gravity they had used when they ambushed me at the restaurant. I called a professional process service, the kind used for high-stakes corporate litigation. I paid for the priority delivery, ensuring it would reach them during their Sunday afternoon family strategy session. I told the server exactly where they would be, sitting on the back porch, likely filming another GoFundMe update on their phones. I instructed him to record the delivery for my own records, citing legal necessity. I spent the next hour watching the GPS tracker on the server's vehicle. I could feel the tension in my own shoulders begin to dissolve. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the plaintiff. I was the auditor. I was the person who finally put a price tag on the sacrifice they had spent 20 years weaponizing. The notification popped up on my screen, service complete. Document delivered. I waited. I knew their process for receiving bad news. First, there would be the laughter, the assumption that I was just being dramatic or petty. Then, they would raid the itemized list. They would see the specific dates, the specific amounts, and the scanned copies of the ledger my father thought was hidden forever. They would see the professional legal header of the process server and realize this wasn't a Facebook post they could report or a comment they could delete. They were looking at a formal demand for payment, backed by a paper trail that could destroy them in a courtroom. The silence from my phone lasted exactly 10 minutes before the first call came in, but it wasn't a call from my mother's phone, it was a call from a number I recognized as a local law firm. I didn't have to wait long for the physical manifestation of their rage. The legal header on that invoice had stripped away the last of their pretenses, and by 7 p.m., the quiet hallway of my apartment building was filled with the sound of heavy, rhythmic thudding. My Ring camera notification flared to life on my phone, and there they were, the three people who had spent my entire life telling me I was the one who didn't understand the meaning of family. My father was leading the charge, his face a mottled shade of red, his fist hammered against my door with enough force to make the frame groan. My mother stood slightly behind him, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, clutching the childhood invoice in her hand like it was a piece of blasphemy. But it was Leo who truly lost control. He was pacing the hallway like a caged animal, screaming about how I was a traitor and how he was going to make sure I never worked in this city again. I sat on my sofa, the lights in my living room dimmed, watching the feed on my tablet. I felt a strange, clinical detachment, the kind of calm you feel when you're watching a storm through thick, reinforced glass. They weren't people to me anymore. They were just data points in a failing system. My father started shouting about the ledger, calling it a fabrication, demanding to know how I dared to put a price on the roof over my head. He didn't seem to realize that by screaming about the cost of my upbringing, he was confirming every single point in my audit. Every "you owe us" that flew out of his mouth was being recorded, time-stamped, and saved to the evidence folder on my cloud drive. Then the sound changed. It wasn't just the door anymore. Leo had moved to the side, toward the narrow window that overlooked the hallway. He started kicking at the glass, the heavy soles of his designer sneakers, shoes I had probably unknowingly financed, cracking against the pane. The first hairline fracture appeared, a silver spider web catching the hallway light. My mother didn't stop him. She cheered him on, telling him to get in there and take what's ours. It was the most honest they had ever been. They weren't here to talk, they were here to pillage the resource they felt was rightfully theirs. I watched Leo pull back his foot for a final, heavy strike, his face contorted with the kind of entitlement that only 25 years of being the golden child can produce. I didn't move from the couch. I didn't reach for a weapon or hide in the bathroom. I simply tapped the microphone icon on my tablet. The chime of the Ring speaker echoed in the hallway, a small, electronic sound that somehow cut through the cacophony of their violence. They all froze. Leo's foot stayed poised in the air, his chest heaving. My father stopped mid-swing, his hand inches from the wood. I kept my voice low, steady, and devoid of any heat. I told them that the entire encounter was being streamed live to a private server and that 4 different neighbors had already called the front desk. I told them that the damage to the window had just been added to Section 5, Line 12 of the invoice under property destruction. My father leaned into the camera, his eyes bloodshot, and spat out that he didn't care about my little games and that he was going to stay there until I wrote the check for the $120,000. He said that no court in the land would side with a son who sued his own parents for nanny fees. He was still operating in the old world, the world where guilt was a currency and blood was a contract. He didn't realize the world had changed the moment I hit send on that Google Drive link. I leaned closer to my tablet, my face a mirror of the coldness in my heart. I told him that I wasn't calling the police for me. I told him I was calling them for the 3 of them. I told them to look behind them. The blue and red lights began to dance against the hallway walls before the elevator doors even finished opening. 2 officers stepped out, their hands resting cautiously near their belts, alerted by the reports of a domestic disturbance and attempted breaking and entering. My family didn't stand down. In their world, they were the victims, and they expected the police to act as their personal enforcement squad. My mother immediately lunged toward the officers, her voice reaching a shrill, practiced vibrato as she pointed a shaking finger at my door. She told them I was a dangerous, mentally unstable man who was financially abusing his elderly parents. She told them I had stolen their car and was holding their life savings hostage. My father joined in, his chest puffed out, trying to use his aggrieved patriarch persona to command the room. He spoke over the officers, demanding they break down my door and force me to hand over the stolen documents. I waited for the officers to establish a perimeter, then I slowly turned the deadbolt. I stepped out into the hallway, not with a weapon or a defensive posture, but with a sleek, leather-bound professional folder. I looked the part of the senior analyst they had tried to ruin, composed, quiet, and impeccably dressed. The contrast was devastating. On one side, 3 people were screaming, sweating, and gesturing wildly like lunatics in a public corridor. On the other, I stood with a level of calm that made the lead officer visibly relax his shoulders. I didn't raise my voice. I simply handed the officer a summary sheet of the restraining order application I had filed electronically an hour prior, along with the printed evidence of the identity theft. I explained, in a voice as steady as a dial tone, that the individuals in the hallway were currently attempting to extort $120,000 from me based on fraudulent debt. I pointed to the cracked window and the scuff marks on my door, then showed the officer the live replay on my tablet of Leo's attempted breach. My mother tried to snatch the tablet from my hand, screaming that I was filtering the truth, but the second officer stepped between us, his voice stern as he told her to back away. The saint versus monster dynamic wasn't just a theory anymore, it was a recorded reality. To the police, I was a tax-paying citizen being harassed in his own home. To the police, my family was a group of trespassers who couldn't keep their stories straight. As the lead officer reviewed the signatures on the fraudulent credit card application, signatures that clearly didn't match mine but bore a striking resemblance to my father's, the tide shifted completely. My father's bravado began to crumble into a stuttering mess of "it's a family matter" and "he's exaggerating." The officers informed them that they needed to leave the premises immediately or face arrest for trespassing and felony vandalism. Leo, sensing the walls closing in, turned to flee toward the elevator, but the second officer stopped him. He noted that the stolen car my mother had complained about was currently parked illegally in the building's fire zone, blocking a hydrant. The officer asked for Leo's ID to write the citation. When Leo opened his car door to retrieve his wallet, a heavy, disorganized pile of mail fell out of the passenger side, dozens of unopened envelopes addressed to me at their house. But it wasn't just the mail that caught the officer's eye. Tucked into the center console was a thick, rubber-banded stack of pre-approved credit card offers in my name, along with a handheld card skimmer. The police didn't just find a messy car, they found a mobile identity theft lab. 6 months have passed since the night the hallway was illuminated by police cruisers and the shattered remains of my family's facade. In the world of forensic accounting, we have a term called the point of total collapse, where the liabilities finally outweigh the assets so severely that the entity ceases to function. Watching my family reach that point has been the most quiet, clinical satisfaction of my life. Because the police discovered the card skimmer and the stash of my mail in Leo's car, the identity theft was no longer a private family dispute, it was a state matter. I didn't have to lift a finger to turn the debt collectors on them. Once the banks realized the $120,000 in credit was predicated on a fraudulent guarantor, they didn't just stop calling me. They unleashed their legal departments on my parents with a ferocity that makes my childhood invoice look like a greeting card. The golden brother finally had his wings clipped by the reality of the penal code. To avoid the harshest sentencing for the identity theft charges, Leo had to accept a plea deal that required him to maintain steady employment and pay restitution. For a man who had never held a job longer than a summer, the shock was total. He is currently working the graveyard shift at a regional distribution warehouse, moving heavy crates for an hourly wage that barely covers his legal fees. The luxury concierge is now a man in a high-visibility vest, and the lifestyle brand has been replaced by a punch clock. My mother's Facebook page, once a vibrant theater of fabricated joy and expensive brunches, has gone completely dark. The neighbors who once sent me hate mail have gone silent, or worse, they've started sending me apology messages now that the court records are public. They saw the family reunion photos I posted, they saw the evidence of the stolen birthday money. The social standing they spent 30 years carefully cultivating has evaporated, replaced by the stinging reality that they are the town's cautionary tale. My parents were forced to downsize. The house I grew up in, the one they held over my head like a mortgage on my soul, was sold at a loss to cover the back taxes and the fraudulent loans. They live in a cramped, two-bedroom apartment on the edge of town now, the kind of place they used to sneer at when they were spending my future. They didn't pay my $135,000 childhood bill in cash. I never expected them to. They paid it in the currency they valued most, their pride. Every time my father has to take the bus because he can no longer afford the insurance on a car he doesn't own, he pays a piece of that debt. Every time my mother has to explain to her bridge club why she isn't at the country club anymore, she settles another line item on my invoice. I moved to a different city 3 months ago. My new firm doesn't know my history, and my new neighbors don't know my name. I've built a life that isn't a resource for anyone else. My bank accounts are private, my credit score has been restored to a pristine 800, and for the first time in my life, I don't wake up wondering whose crisis I have to solve today. I had reached a place of true equilibrium, or so I thought, until a week ago. I was checking my secure P.O. box when I found a single, handwritten envelope. There was no return address, but I recognized the frantic, looping cursive of my mother's handwriting immediately. I expected a curse. I expected a final, bitter condemnation or a demand for a loan to keep them from the brink. But as I sat in my car and tore open the seal, the cold burn returned with a vengeance. It wasn't an apology. It was a desperate, panicked plea for me to stop the deeper investigation. She wrote that the debt collectors were starting to look into the life insurance policy from my grandfather's passing 20 years ago, the one I was told had vanished in the stock market crash. The letter was a confession wrapped in a warning. She admitted that the $120,000 was just the tip of the iceberg, and that if the auditors keep digging, they're going to find out what they really did with the inheritance that was supposed to be my college fund. She begged me to call off the dogs, not for her sake, but because there was one more person involved in the theft that I hadn't accounted for yet. I didn't answer the letter. I didn't call off the auditors, and I didn't go looking for whatever was left of a grandfather's ghost. Instead, I dropped the confession into a shredder and watched the last tether of my old life turn into confetti. The dark secret of the inheritance was just another line item in a ledger that had already been closed. I realized that the true cost of my childhood wasn't the money they stole, it was the peace of mind they never intended for me to have. By sending that final invoice, I wasn't just asking for reimbursement, I was buying my own freedom. I was declaring that the bank of my empathy was officially insolvent and that I no longer recognized the debt of my own existence. I'm sitting on the balcony of my new home now, watching the sunset over a skyline my family will never see. The air here is different. It doesn't carry the weight of expectation or the sharp tang of impending crisis. There are no manila envelopes on my table, no hidden ledgers in my closet, and no voices telling me that my success is a family asset. I have surrounded myself with people who don't see me as a resource to be mined, but as a person to be known. My receipt for this new life isn't a bank statement or a court order. It is the profound, heavy silence of my phone on a Sunday afternoon. It is the ability to walk through my own front door and know that every square inch of the floor beneath my feet was earned by my own hands and belongs to no one else. The cold burn has finally faded into a steady, warming glow. I've learned that you cannot fix a system that was designed to break you, and you cannot negotiate with people who view your boundaries as an act of war. Sometimes, the only way to win is to stop playing the role they assign to you. If you are currently sitting where I was, feeling the weight of a family that views your love as a line of credit, understand this: your life is not a repayment plan. If you're being told you owe your parents for your existence, remember, you didn't ask to be born, but you can choose how you live. Like this video if you've ever sent a bill to a toxic person.